The entire internet could disappear tomorrow, and we would face a digital dark age. This exact catastrophe happened before, not once but many times, when the great libraries of the ancient world burned. The ghostly absence of places like the Library of Alexandria haunts our modern technology, creating knowledge gaps that still stall our progress in artificial intelligence and data science. By the end of this, you will understand how to protect our own digital legacy from repeating these ancient mistakes. We will uncover what truly vanished in those fires and why a forgotten text on steam power might have changed everything. What would our world look like if those scrolls had never turned to ash? These ancient repositories were engines of civilization, not silent tombs for books. Think of the Library of Alexandria not as a museum but as a buzzing, collaborative workshop. Scholars from across the known world gathered there, tasked with an almost impossible mission to collect every single book in existence. They did not just stash scrolls away on shelves. They actively translated texts from dozens of languages, debated their meanings, and wrote detailed critiques. This process transformed raw information into usable, verified knowledge. It was a living, breathing system of peer review that accelerated learning at an unprecedented rate. A discovery made in Babylon on astronomy could be cross-referenced with Egyptian records on geometry, leading to new insights that would have been impossible in isolation. This constant churn of ideas powered leaps in medicine, like the detailed human anatomies of Herophilus, and in engineering, with Archimedes laying the foundations for calculus. The library was a catalyst compressing centuries of potential progress into generations. Its ultimate goal was a complete copy of the world's memory, a single, searchable database made of papyrus and ink. Does that sound familiar? It is the same driving force behind our own modern internet and the global push to digitize every book, painting, and song. We are building our own Alexandria, one server farm at a time. The terrifying truth is that their ambitious project was almost a success. They came staggeringly close to gathering the entire intellectual output of the ancient world. And that is precisely what makes its disappearance an intellectual catastrophe of almost unimaginable scale. The true horror is not just that knowledge was lost, but that we came so close to preserving it all. The final destruction of the Library of Alexandria was not a dramatic, single fire. It was a slow, agonizing death by 1,000 cuts, unfolding over centuries. The first major blow came when Julius Caesar was embroiled in a civil war and accidentally set fire to a section of the city's port, a district where many of the library's scrolls were stored in warehouses. That was just the beginning. Later, during a Roman imperial power struggle, another part of the city and its knowledge was sacrificed. Then came religious edicts that condemned certain texts as pagan, leading to their systematic removal and destruction. Each event chipped away at the great library's soul until one day there was simply nothing left to burn. This pattern of gradual decay was a blueprint for how knowledge dies. The Royal Library of Ashurbanipal in Nineveh was crushed by invading armies. The magnificent Library of Pergamum, with its 200,000 volumes, was famously given as a political gift to Alexandria, redistributing its wealth but also centralizing the risk. Centuries later, the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, a beacon of science and mathematics during the Islamic Golden Age, was utterly annihilated. The Mongols stormed the city, and so many priceless books were thrown into the Tigris River that legend says the water ran black with ink for months. Each of these cataclysms did not just destroy a building, it erased a unique perspective. the library at Nineveh held the only copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh. The House of Wisdom housed translated works of Greek thinkers that were lost everywhere else, alongside groundbreaking original research in algebra and optics. When a single library fell, it was not one book that was lost, but an entire branch of human thought, a school of philosophy, a lineage of scientific inquiry. The cumulative effect of these serial disappearances is a historical record filled with maddening silences. We have fragments of plays by the Greek tragedian Aeschylus, but we know he wrote over 90. We have references to revolutionary mechanical devices from the Hellenistic era, but the blueprints are gone forever. This intellectual black hole is not empty space. It is a phantom limb of our collective consciousness, an ache for what we know we once possessed but can no longer reach. This long, sorrowful timeline of paper and fire sets the stage for a haunting question. If our own digital world, our global Alexandria, were to follow this same pattern of vulnerability, what unique branches of our own knowledge would simply vanish from the earth? The true cost of Alexandria is measured not in burned scrolls but in the centuries of progress we lost. Within its walls were ideas so revolutionary that the world would not conceive of them again for over 1,000 years. The astronomer Aristarchus of Samos had meticulously laid out a model where the Earth and other planets revolved around the Sun. His work was there, but when the library faded, his heliocentric theory faded with it, forcing figures like Copernicus to start from scratch nearly 18 centuries later. That is the staggering delay a single knowledge collapse can cause. Other scrolls describe devices that seem to defy their time, like a simple steam-powered turbine built by Hero of Alexandria. It was a toy, a novelty, but the principles were sound. Imagine if that knowledge had been built upon instead of buried. The Industrial Revolution might not have waited for the 18th century. The library was a unique fusion, a place where Greek logic met Egyptian engineering and Babylonian astronomy. This cross-cultural exchange was its greatest strength, and its destruction severed those global connections. It turned a vibrant network into isolated pockets of information. The tragedy is that we know the names of some of the brilliant texts that vanished, but we have no idea how many more we do not even know we lost. Every one of those lost scrolls represents a potential technological path, a branch on the tree of human innovation that was cut off before it could even begin to grow. This demonstrates a chilling principle that when we concentrate our greatest knowledge in one place, we also concentrate our greatest risk. Alexandria teaches us that intellectual capital is not a permanent asset. It is more like a flame, and it can be extinguished with terrifying speed, leaving the world colder and darker for generations. We often focus on Alexandria, but its fate was a template repeated across the globe. The Great Library of Pergamum was so formidable that it directly competed with Alexandria, amassing a collection of nearly 200,000 scrolls. Its end was not a grand fire but a quiet dismantling. Much of its collection was gifted to Alexandria as a political maneuver, a transfer that saved the texts only to centralize them in a place that would itself eventually fall. The rest of the library was slowly dispersed or destroyed over time, its unique voice in philosophy and science fading into silence. Far to the east, the Imperial Library of Constantinople presented a different story of survival against the odds. It endured centuries of fires, sacks, and sieges, acting as a fragile lifeboat for classical knowledge through the European Dark Ages. It managed to preserve precious copies of Greek and Roman texts, but each disaster it survived still claimed irreplaceable pieces of the puzzle. Then there was the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, perhaps the closest the world ever came to a second Alexandria. For centuries, it was the global center for science, where scholars translated the works of Greece and India while pioneering new fields in algebra and astronomy. Its destruction was swift and absolute. When the Mongols sacked the city in 1258, they threw so many manuscripts into the Tigris River that the waters were said to run black with ink, a river of knowledge literally drowning before the world's eyes. Across the world in India, the vast library of Nalanda University met a similar fiery end. It was not just a library but a 9-story university complex, a magnet for scholars from as far away as Persia and Korea. Its shelves groaned under the weight of Buddhist scriptures, medical texts, and treatises on mathematics and logic. When invaders set it ablaze, the fire was said to have burned for months, obliterating a unique fusion of spiritual and secular wisdom that has never been fully recovered. Each of these centers held a unique piece of the human story. Pergamum had its own distinct commentaries. Constantinople held legal and historical records that existed nowhere else. The House of Wisdom possessed original astronomical charts and chemical research. Nalanda safeguarded entire schools of Buddhist philosophy. Their collective destruction did not create one single gap in history. It created a patchwork of missing information, a fractured and incomplete picture of our own past. The vulnerability of knowledge was not a localized tragedy, it was a global pandemic of forgetting. This pattern of loss forces a difficult question. If our civilization's memory is stored in just a few key locations, whether they are made of stone or silicon, are we not setting ourselves up for the exact same catastrophe? The ghost of Alexandria is not an empty space, it is a collection of specific, devastating silences. We are not mourning the loss of just any books, but the absolute pinnacle of ancient science and philosophy. These were the research and development labs of their time, holding breakthroughs that would not be seen again for over a millennium. Consider the mathematics. We have fragments and mentions of work by geniuses like Archimedes that suggest he was laying the very foundations of calculus, grappling with concepts of infinity, and change that Isaac Newton and Gottfried Leibniz would only formalize nearly 2,000 years later. That single loss alone represents a colossal delay in the entire trajectory of physics and engineering. The medical knowledge that evaporated was equally profound. Scrolls contained detailed anatomical observations from dissections, along with sophisticated herbal remedies and surgical procedures. These texts were not mere superstition, they were the results of careful, empirical study. When they were lost, European medicine effectively reverted for centuries, forced to relearn through painful trial and error what had already been discovered and documented. Imagine the suffering that could have been alleviated if that knowledge had flowed uninterrupted. Then there were the engineering marvels described in texts now turned to ash. We know of complex automata, self-operating machines powered by steam or water, and architectural techniques for creating vast, unsupported domes. These were not just theoretical ideas, they were built. The blueprints, however, are gone. The famous Antikythera Mechanism, a breathtakingly complex ancient Greek analog computer for predicting astronomical positions, is a solitary surviving clue pointing to a level of mechanical sophistication we never knew existed. It is a lone survivor from a shipwreck, hinting at an entire lost fleet of technological wonders. Beyond science, the historical and geographical accounts that vanished have left permanent holes in our understanding of the ancient world. We have only one side of the story for countless wars, migrations, and diplomatic exchanges. Entire civilizations are known to us only through the biased accounts of their conquerors. Their own voices, their own records of their culture and achievements, were stored in a single library and are now silenced forever. This intellectual vacuum created a domino effect that stunted human progress for generations. Every field of inquiry had to start over from a much weaker position. Instead of building upon the shoulders of giants, scholars were left standing on the rubble. The collective knowledge of the ancient world was not a linear progression that we simply continued. It was a peak that was scaled and then forgotten, forcing us to slowly and painfully climb the same mountain all over again. The true cost of those burned libraries is not measured in the past, but in the absent future they could have created. So if our own digital records, our fragile collection of ones and zeros, were to suffer a similar collapse, what pinnacles of our own understanding would we be forcing future generations to painfully rediscover 1,000 years from now? That single Antikythera mechanism pulled from a shipwreck is a fossil of a lost technological age. It is not just an artifact, it is an accusation. Its intricate bronze gears, capable of predicting planetary movements and eclipses, represent a mastery of mechanics that simply vanishes from the historical record for over 1,000 years. This was not a one-off miracle. It was a product of a knowledge system, a school of engineering whose textbooks and design principles were almost certainly housed in the great libraries. When those libraries burned, the instruction manuals for such devices burned with them. The result was not a pause, but a full system reboot for human ingenuity. Every gear, every principle of leverage and hydraulics that hero of Alexandria wrote about had to be painstakingly rediscovered. This is the domino effect of lost knowledge in its purest form. One fallen library does not just erase a list of facts, it topples an entire lineage of innovation, forcing the next generation to begin again at the last saved point, which was often centuries behind. Think of the cumulative delay this caused. The foundational work of Greek mathematicians on conic sections, vital for understanding optics and planetary orbits, was lost and had to be redone. Early chemical experiments from Alexandria, exploring the nature of materials, were erased. This meant that when brilliant minds like Newton or Galileo began their work, they were not standing on the shoulders of giants. They were standing on an empty plain, rebuilding the giants from scattered fragments. They were racing to catch up to a past that had been deleted. This innovation gap had real-world consequences that cost millions of lives. Medical knowledge from the Library of Alexandria, which included detailed anatomical studies and advanced surgical techniques, was wiped away. For centuries, physicians in Europe bled patients with leeches, unaware that texts describing more effective treatments had already been written and then lost. Progress in navigation stalled without sophisticated astronomical charts, making sea travel more perilous and limiting exploration. The development of stronger materials and more efficient energy sources was set back immeasurably. The steam engine, a novelty in Alexandria, became a world-changing invention only after a delay of nearly 2 millennia. This is the haunting echo of that ancient collapse. Our current technological challenges, from mastering fusion energy to developing advanced artificial intelligence, are built upon a mountain of preserved data, research papers, and code. We are accelerating because we can build directly on the work of those who came before us. But the ghost of Alexandria reminds us of the fragility of that mountain. It shows us that progress is not a law of nature. It is a fragile chain of transmission, and every broken link forces us to walk a path we have already walked, blind to the milestones we passed long ago. That same fragility now defines our digital world, where a power surge can be as final as a Mongol siege. Our modern archives are not made of papyrus and ink, but of magnetic charges on spinning platters and flickering electrons in solid-state drives. They face their own set of existential threats. each one a digital echo of an ancient disaster. Where fire and water once turned scrolls to ash and pulp, we now confront sophisticated cyber attacks that can wipe entire servers clean, catastrophic system failures, and the slow, silent rot of format obsolescence. A file saved on a floppy disk just 30 years ago is now as inaccessible as a sealed scroll in a forgotten tomb, not because the data is gone, but because we have lost the key to read it. This is the heart of the digital dark age hypothesis, the terrifying possibility that future historians will stare at our hard drives and cloud servers as we stare at the scant fragments of the Library of Alexandria, unable to access the vast cultural record we left behind. Our great modern libraries are the colossal server farms operated by a handful of global corporations. We have concentrated humanity's knowledge in these digital Alexandrias, creating unparalleled efficiency at the cost of creating devastating single points of failure. A successful attack on one major cloud provider or a cascading infrastructure collapse could erase petabytes of data in an instant, from government records and scientific research to a family's entire photo history. This mirrors the centralization of scrolls in the ancient world, a strategy that amplified both their power and their peril. And just as the loss of the library's master catalog made its remaining scrolls a chaotic, unsearchable mystery, losing the metadata and indexing that organizes our digital world would render the surviving data a meaningless digital soup. We would be left with trillions of files with no way to understand their context or their connections. The fundamental challenge remains unchanged across the millennia. How do we preserve knowledge not just for a few years, but for centuries, amidst constantly shifting technologies and the relentless emergence of new threats? Acknowledging this parallel is not an admission of defeat. It is our greatest advantage, a chance to learn from the ghost of Alexandria and build a memory for humanity that is not just vast but truly resilient. This cycle of loss and rediscovery imposes a hidden tax on every modern breakthrough. We see this cost most starkly in the pharmaceutical industry, where companies pour billions of dollars and decades of research into discovering new drugs. In a painful irony, they sometimes arrive at a chemical compound that was already identified in an ancient herbal remedy, a treatment described in a scroll that turned to dust centuries ago. The active ingredient in aspirin, for instance, was used in willow bark for pain relief for millennia, yet its formal isolation and synthesis required a massive, redundant investment. This duplication of effort across the centuries represents an incalculable waste of human intellect and financial capital. The same pattern repeats in engineering. Modern materials scientists have painstakingly redeveloped formulas for incredibly durable concrete, only to discover that Roman builders, whose seaports still stand after 2,000 years, possessed a superior recipe that was lost to time. We had to reinvent their knowledge, spending vast resources to solve a problem that had already been mastered. Even in the seemingly brand new field of computer science, the foundational concept of binary logic, the ones and zeros that power every digital device, was explored by ancient scholars in India and elsewhere. We built our modern world from first principles, unaware that the blueprints had been drawn long before. This time lag between original discovery and modern rediscovery has delayed countless innovations in medicine, construction, and energy. The cumulative effect is a civilization constantly playing catch-up with its own forgotten genius. Every dollar spent relearning what we once knew is a dollar not spent on pushing into genuinely new territory. Every brilliant mind dedicated to solving an old problem is a mind not focused on the next great frontier. The ghost of Alexandria does not just haunt our history books, it actively drains our present and constrains our future. Those lost scrolls were more than just theory. They were the user manuals for an ancient technological revolution. Think of the great engineers not as mythical figures, but as authors who wrote down their methods. Archimedes created fantastical war machines that defended Syracuse, devices so effective they seemed like the work of gods. But the precise instructions for building them, the ratios, the measurements, the blueprints, were almost certainly housed in the Library of Alexandria. When it fell, those instructions turned to dust. We are left with legends of clawed cranes that could lift ships from the water and death rays of focused sunlight, but we have no way to verify or replicate them. The know-how vanished. This pattern repeats with Heron of Alexandria, who described a working steam engine, automated temple doors, and intricate coin-operated machines. His text survived in fragments, but the complete engineering schematics are gone. We know what he achieved, but we lost the step-by-step guide to how he did it. It is the difference between seeing a photograph of a stunning building and having the architect's full set of detailed plans. One is a marvel, the other is a tool you can build with. The same erasure happened to advanced metallurgy. Manuscripts detailing the production of flexible Damascus steel or the secret Roman concrete that hardens underwater were lost in the fires of libraries. This was not abstract knowledge. It was applied science, the specific recipes and forging techniques that gave ancient artisans a material advantage. Without these texts, later blacksmiths and builders had to spend centuries reinventing the wheel, or in this case, the sword and the seawall. They progressed through slow, painful trial and error, a process littered with failures that a single surviving manual could have prevented. Even the majestic domes of structures like the Pantheon stand as silent witnesses to a lost education. The architectural treatises that explain the physics of their construction, the careful calculation of weight distribution, and the perfect mix of their concrete did not survive intact. Later architects attempting similar feats had to guess, and many of their domes collapsed. The knowledge of hydraulic engineering, so vital for the Roman aqueducts that brought fresh water to entire cities, became fragmented. The precise formulas for calculating flow rate, the techniques for maintaining consistent elevation over vast distances, the secrets of their self-cleaning sedimentation tanks, all of this practical wisdom was scattered and then lost. The consequence was not merely a pause, it was a regression. Societies that followed often lacked the infrastructure to support large urban populations because they could not maintain or replicate the sophisticated water systems of their predecessors. The disappearance of these applied texts created a technological valley, a dip in our capabilities that took over 1,000 years to climb out of. We do not just mourn the loss of beautiful poetry or philosophical debates. We feel the tangible absence of the instruction manuals that could have built a different world. This ghost still lingers in our own engineering schools, where students must learn principles that were once documented, then forgotten, and are now being painfully rediscovered. It begs a question for our own digital age. What crucial manuals are we storing in formats that could become just as unreadable as a crumbled scroll? The true void left by those fires is not just one of machines, but of minds. Beyond the blueprints for steam engines and complex gears, the libraries held the complete thoughts of philosophers whose ideas could have rerouted the entire river of human consciousness. We know the names of the pre-Socratic thinkers, men like Heraclitus and Democritus, who first proposed that everything is made of atoms. But their own words, the full texts where they laid out their visions of reality, survive only as quotations in the works of their critics. It is like trying to understand a magnificent painting by looking only at the angry scribbles someone drew in the margin. We have fragments, but the whole argument, the nuanced journey of their logic, is gone forever. This creates a permanent distortion in the foundation of Western thought. we are left with a family tree of philosophy that has its deepest roots chopped away. Even the giants we think we know, like Plato and Aristotle, are incomplete. We possess their major works, but ancient catalogues list dozens of their dialogues and treatises that have vanished. What ethical dilemmas did Plato explore in a lost conversation? What political model did Aristotle outline in a missing scroll? A single sentence from one of these lost books might have provided a different lens for justice or governance, potentially preventing centuries of political strife or offering a forgotten path to social harmony. The chain of intellectual influence was broken, forcing medieval and Renaissance thinkers to rebuild philosophy with a partial set of tools. They were arguing with ghosts, unaware of the full scope of the ideas that had come before them. This erosion was a global phenomenon. In the East, the burning of libraries like Nalanda did not just destroy buildings, it extinguished entire schools of Buddhist and Hindu philosophy. These were sophisticated systems of logic, metaphysics, and ethics that were debated for generations, only to be silenced in a single act of violence. Their absence means that modern scholars must piece together these worldviews from second-hand accounts and surviving fragments in other languages, forever wondering about the subtle arguments that were lost. The philosophical landscape of humanity is not naturally sparse. It was deliberately pruned by fire and sword. The consequence of this great silencing is that our modern world debates ethics and knowledge on a narrowed foundation. When we grapple with the moral implications of artificial intelligence or the societal impact of genetic engineering, we are using philosophical frameworks that are missing entire wings of their original architecture. We lack the counter-arguments, the alternative starting points that those lost texts might have provided. A different interpretation of justice from a lost Aristotelian text could have influenced the development of human rights law. A more nuanced view of consciousness from a forgotten Eastern sage might have given us a better language for discussing machine sentience today. The ghost of Alexandria, therefore, is not just a historical curiosity. It is an active participant in our most pressing modern debates, its silence forever shaping the questions we are able to ask and the answers we are capable of imagining. This fragmentation of history means we are navigating the past with a map full of blank spaces. The Minoan civilization of Crete built vast, labyrinthine palaces and thrived for centuries, yet we know them almost entirely through their pottery and their architecture. Their written language, Linear A, remains undeciphered because the libraries that held the bilingual dictionaries or administrative records are gone. We can see the shape of their society, but we cannot hear their voices or understand their laws. The same silence echoes for countless others. We have the names of Babylonian kings from king lists, but the rich historical chronicles that detailed their reigns, their wars, and their decisions have largely turned to dust. Historians are forced to become detectives, piecing together the story of empires from broken pottery, passing mentions in enemy accounts, and the inscriptions on monuments designed for propaganda, not for truth. This is not just an academic inconvenience, it is a fundamental blindness. Genealogies that tracked inheritance and social mobility are missing. Detailed legal codes that revealed how justice was administered are lost. Economic records that showed the flow of goods and the stability of markets have vanished. Without these documents, the ancient world becomes a collection of beautiful ruins without a clear understanding of the people who lived in them. This has profound consequences for our own time. We cannot accurately track long-term climate patterns without the detailed harvest records and weather observations that were stored in those libraries. The history of pandemics is full of guesswork because the medical logs and population data from ancient plagues are missing. Patterns of human migration, the reasons why great cities were abandoned or new lands were settled remain shrouded in mystery. This lack of a complete baseline makes us vulnerable. We try to learn from history, but we are trying to learn from a book with half its pages ripped out. When modern leaders look to the past for guidance on managing an economic crisis or a public health emergency, the data they need to see the full cycle of cause and effect is often incomplete. We are forced to make decisions with only a partial understanding of what has already been tried, what has failed, and what has succeeded. The ghost of Alexandria does not just haunt our museums, it whispers in our policy chambers, reminding us that a society which loses its memory is doomed to face its future without its most vital tool. Another layer of this tragedy is the silence of languages we can no longer understand. The great libraries held countless texts written in languages and scripts that are now extinct, and their destruction means we lost the very dictionaries and grammars we would need to read them. The Rosetta Stone, with its parallel text in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphics, was a miraculous exception. For every Rosetta Stone that survived, countless other multilingual inscriptions and teaching aids were burned or crumbled to dust, taking their linguistic keys with them forever. This is why scripts like Linear from the Minoans or Etruscan from pre-Roman Italy remain stubbornly undeciphered. The critical texts that could have acted as a bridge, the Etruscan to Greek phrasebooks or the Linear administrative ledgers that might have shown us patterns, are gone. We have the artifacts, but the voices are mute, even for languages we do know, like the ancient Akkadian of Mesopotamia or classical Sanskrit. The loss is profound. The libraries held vast literary works, detailed technical manuals, and personal letters that showed the living, breathing use of these tongues. Without them, our understanding is skeletal. We might know the basic grammar and vocabulary, but we miss the poetry, the nuance, the cultural context that gave the language its soul. This creates a permanent barrier between us and the past. Imagine a future archaeologist finding a hard drive full of our data, but the only surviving manual is for a different, unrelated operating system. They could see the information is there, but they would have no way to access its meaning. That is our predicament with the ancient world. Every new archaeological discovery, every scroll recovered from the ashes of Vesuvius, faces this same linguistic wall. We may have the physical object, but without the library that held the translation guide, its secrets may remain locked away indefinitely. This fragmentation of human language complicates our search for any kind of universal knowledge. The ghost of Alexandria, therefore, is not just a ghost of lost information, but a ghost of lost communication. It reminds us that knowledge is not just data, it is meaning, and meaning requires a shared language to survive. The silence of those libraries echoes loudest in the art we can no longer hear. Ancient Greek dramas were not just plays to be read, they were profound multimedia experiences, integrating poetry, dance, and most crucially, music. The scores, the actual melodies that guided the chorus and underscored the tragic heroes, were written down. They were stored in the great libraries alongside the scripts. Today, we have the words of plays by Aeschylus and Euripides, but the music that gave them their emotional power is entirely gone. We can only stare at the lyrics of a song whose tune has been forgotten for 2,000 years. This loss is a form of cultural amnesia, a collective forgetting of the very sounds that shaped a civilization's identity. The same erasure happened on a global scale. We know from references that there were vast Mesopotamian epics beyond Gilgamesh and vibrant Celtic sagas performed by bards. Their titles survive in catalogues, but the works themselves have vanished into the air. Our entire perception of the ancient world is skewed toward the texts that survived by pure chance, often in remote monasteries or dry desert climates. not necessarily the works that were considered the most beautiful or important in their own time. This random sampling creates a distorted mirror. We see the ancient Greeks as purely philosophical and logical, but what if the lost music revealed a culture of overwhelming, ecstatic emotion? We view Roman art through the lens of marble statues, but what if the lost treatises on painting described a theory of color and light that would have made the Renaissance unfold in a completely different direction? The artistic techniques and aesthetic philosophies that burned in Alexandria could have provided a direct pipeline of inspiration, bypassing centuries of medieval stylistic development. Instead, artists like Michelangelo had to rediscover classical ideals from broken statues, unaware of the theoretical foundations that explained why they were so powerful. This fragmentation of cultural memory directly impacts how modern societies construct their own identities. Our sense of Western heritage is built on a foundation with entire rooms locked shut. A nation might base its pride on a particular epic poem or artistic style, never knowing that a rival tradition, just as rich, was erased from the record. Education curricula are filled with the works that survived, inevitably presenting them as the canon, the most important achievements, when in reality they are merely the ones that got away. The ghost of lost art is a reminder that culture is not a permanent monument. It is a fragile performance that requires an audience across generations. Our technology today can record a symphony in perfect digital clarity, but if the society that understands its context disappears, that file becomes as meaningless as a Greek musical notation we can no longer decipher. Preserving culture demands more than just storing data. It requires the active, continuous transmission of meaning from one generation to the next. That same silencing of ancient voices delayed the birth of science itself. We often think of the scientific method as a modern invention, but its core principles of observation, experimentation, and record-keeping were actively practiced in the great libraries. The work of Eratosthenes is a perfect example. He did not just guess at the size of our world, he designed an experiment. By measuring the angle of a shadow in two different cities at the same time and applying geometry, he calculated the Earth's circumference with an accuracy that would not be surpassed for over 1,000 years. His results were recorded, but the detailed methodology, the notes on his assumptions and potential errors, the very blueprint of his inquiry, vanished with the library that housed them. It was a standalone marvel, not a teachable, repeatable process that could be systematically applied to other fields. This loss of method was more devastating than the loss of any single fact. Ancient medicine was far more advanced than we once believed. Texts from the school of Herophilus described systematic human dissection, leading to discoveries about the brain and nervous system. These were not just theories, they were empirical findings based on direct observation. Other medical scrolls likely contained records akin to early clinical trials, comparing the outcomes of different treatments on groups of patients. When these documents were lost, medicine was forced back into a dark age of superstition, and the very idea of testing a treatment against a control group had to be painfully rediscovered centuries later. The destruction of long-term astronomical records represents another catastrophic blow to the scientific process. Babylonian astronomers meticulously tracked the movements of planets for generations, compiling datasets that could reveal subtle cosmic patterns over centuries. This data was the lifeblood of science, the raw material needed to formulate and test laws of planetary motion. Its destruction meant that later astronomers like Kepler had to start their work with a much shorter timeline of observations, slowing their progress immeasurably. Even the seemingly mystical work of alchemists contained the seeds of modern chemistry. Their laboratories were filled with experiments on distillation, crystallization, and the properties of metals. They recorded their procedures and their results, both the successes and the failures. But when their notebooks were burned, that practical, hands-on knowledge of how materials behave and interact had to be slowly, and often dangerously, reassembled from scratch. This collective loss of empirical data and methodological approaches created a profound delay. Instead of a continuous, accelerating tradition of systematic inquiry, humanity experienced a long interruption. The formal development of the scientific method in the early modern period was not a sudden spark of genius. It was a reinvention made necessary by a millennium of missing instructions. This delay haunts our modern approach to complex problems like climate change and pandemic response, where we rely so heavily on long-term data modeling. How much more confident would our predictions be if they were built upon 2,000 additional years of recorded observations? These forgotten manuscripts were not just records of what was, but blueprints for what could have been. The ghost of Alexandria is a ghost of alternative futures, a world where history branched onto paths we can now only barely trace. The most haunting of these might be the lost potential of steam. Heron of Alexandria built a working turbine, a device that spun from the force of heated water, yet it remained a temple curiosity. The detailed engineering texts that could have guided others to scale it up, to connect it to pumps and looms, turned to ash. The core principles of an industrial revolution were present in that library, waiting for the right mind to link them together, but that connection was never made. The knowledge died in one place, and the world had to wait another 1,800 years for James Watt to see the same potential in a boiling kettle. This was not an isolated case. The intricate automata described in other texts, mechanical servants and singing birds powered by compressed air and complex gears, were more than toys. They were demonstrations of a deep understanding of pneumatics and programmable sequences. Without those blueprints circulating and inspiring others, the path toward sophisticated machinery was severed before it could even begin. The same erasure happened with chemistry. The formula for Roman concrete, a material that hardens underwater and lasts for millennia, was a closely guarded secret. It was written down, but when the libraries holding those recipes burned, the secret was lost for good. Modern scientists have spent decades trying to reverse engineer it, a costly and time-consuming effort to reclaim a single branch of ancient material science. Damascus steel, famed for its sharp, flexible blades, involved a unique forging process with alloys from India. That specific metallurgical knowledge vanished with the workshops and their manuals, creating a legendary material that modern blacksmiths can imitate but never truly replicate. Each of these losses represents a closed door. Medicine faced a similar regression. Elaborate sets of surgical tools for delicate operations, like those for cataracts or bladder stones, are found by archaeologists. But the manuals that described their precise use, the procedures for sanitation and aftercare, did not survive. Later physicians, lacking this accumulated wisdom, had to reinvent these complex procedures, often with horrifying rates of infection and failure. Agricultural knowledge suffered a parallel fate. Scrolls detailing crop rotation, soil management, and grafting techniques for higher yields were lost. Societies that had once supported vast urban populations found their food supplies becoming less reliable, leading to famines and abandonment of cities. The knowledge of which plants could fix nitrogen in the soil or how to create resilient seed stocks was scattered to the winds. This collective forgetting meant that every civilization after the Great Burnings had to restart its technological journey from a much earlier save point. The cumulative effect is a world built on a single, narrow track of development. We inherited the technologies that survived the filter of catastrophe, not necessarily the best or most elegant ones. Our entire modern landscape of innovation is shaped by these absences. We are now pushing against the limits of battery chemistry and material science, struggling to find new superconductors or more efficient solar cells. How many of these puzzles would already be solved if we had access to the full library of human experimentation? The ghost of Alexandria asks us a difficult question about our own time. As we pour resources into a few dominant technological paradigms, are we inadvertently closing off other, potentially more fruitful, paths for our own future? This paradox of centralization was the great strength and the fatal flaw of Alexandria. By gathering the world's knowledge into a single, magnificent repository, they created an engine of progress unlike any before it. Scholars could cross-reference Babylonian astronomy with Egyptian geometry, sparking innovations that would have been impossible in isolation. This concentration of intellectual capital accelerated civilization, but it also concentrated the risk. The library became the ultimate single point of failure. It was an irresistible target for any conqueror seeking to symbolically erase a culture, or for any ideology intent on purging disagreeable ideas. A single fire, one act of war, or a period of political instability could and did erase the work of millennia. The very strategy that enabled a golden age also guaranteed its vulnerability. We see this same dangerous bargain playing out in our digital world. Our modern Alexandrias are the colossal server farms and cloud platforms operated by a handful of corporations. We have poured the sum of our collective knowledge, from scientific data to family photos, into these centralized digital temples. The efficiency is breathtaking, but the peril is ancient. A sophisticated cyber attack, a cascading power failure, or a natural disaster targeting a key data hub could trigger a loss of information on a scale that would make the burning of scrolls look trivial. It is the centralization paradox reborn in silicon, yet history also offers a model for resilience. While the great libraries burned, knowledge often survived in decentralized, distributed networks. Think of the medieval monastic scriptoria scattered across Europe. No single monastery held all of classical learning, but each one preserved a few precious texts. When one monastery was sacked, its unique copies might be lost, but the works themselves survived elsewhere. This fragmented, redundant system lacked the explosive synergy of a great library, but it provided a slow, steady lifeline for knowledge through the darkest ages. The lesson for our time is not to abandon our digital Alexandrias, but to learn from the monks. We must build systems where our most vital knowledge is not just stored in one centralized cloud, but is actively mirrored, preserved in multiple formats, and distributed across independent archives. The ghost of centralized knowledge whispers a clear warning from the past, urging us not to put all of our intellectual eggs in one fragile, digital basket. Our own digital records are turning to dust before our eyes. The files you saved on a floppy disk just a few decades ago are now trapped in a plastic tomb, not because the physical disk has crumbled, but because the language it speaks, its file format, has become a forgotten dialect. We have no universal Rosetta Stone for our own digital creations. This format obsolescence is our version of losing the key to a lost language. A silent erasure happening not in a fiery cataclysm, but in the quiet march of software updates. The very media we trust to hold our memories are also betraying us. Hard drives have a finite lifespan, their magnetic fields slowly fading like ink exposed to sunlight. Optical discs like CDs and DVDs are susceptible to a slow chemical decay called disk rot, where the data layer oxidizes and becomes unreadable. This is the digital equivalent of papyrus crumbling or parchment being devoured by worms, a slow, inexorable decay that does not require a single flame. And the scale of the problem is almost paralyzing. We are generating more data in a single year than the ancient world produced in millennia, yet we lack the resources to carefully curate and preserve even a fraction of it. Who decides what is saved? The task of manually backing up essential knowledge feels as monumental as the scribes of Alexandria trying to copy every scroll by hand. But now the scrolls are multiplying at a dizzying, uncontrollable rate. Even the connections between our knowledge are fraying. On the internet, link rot silently severs the threads that tie information together. A cited source in a research paper, a contextual explanation in a news article, a crucial piece of code in a software library, all can vanish overnight, leaving behind a digital dead end. This is precisely what happened when the catalogs and indexes of the ancient libraries were lost, turning their surviving scrolls into a chaotic, incomprehensible jumble. We are creating a future digital archaeology site where the artifacts are present, but their relationships and meanings are gone. And just as ideological purges led to the targeted destruction of scrolls, our digital world faces its own ideological threats in the form of sophisticated cyber attacks. A single, well-planned ransomware attack or a state-sponsored digital siege could wipe out the data of an entire hospital system, a government archive, or a global research institution. The motivation is different, but the effect is the same: the deliberate annihilation of a segment of human knowledge for a specific purpose. This chilling parallel suggests a profound and uncomfortable truth. For all our advanced technology, we have failed to internalize the most basic lesson from history, that knowledge is fragile and its guardianship requires a conscious, proactive strategy. The ghost of Alexandria is no longer just a memory of burned papyrus. It is the specter of a looming digital dark age, a future where our grandchildren inherit our hard drives as we inherited the Antikythera Mechanism, as beautiful, baffling, and silent relics of a world they can no longer understand. Political will is the invisible architecture that holds up any library, whether it is built of stone or silicon. The great libraries of antiquity did not just explode in a single, dramatic fire. More often, they faded when the kings and caliphs who funded them were overthrown, when the public lost interest, or when the scribes' salaries could no longer be paid. The slow death of a library begins with a cancelled budget, a discontinued translation project, a decision that maintenance is no longer a priority. It is a quiet, administrative collapse that makes the final fiery cataclysm possible. This is the core lesson for our own time. We cannot simply build a digital archive and walk away, assuming its existence alone is enough. Digital preservation is not a project with a completion date. It is a permanent, ongoing commitment that requires continuous funding, vigilant updating, and a society that agrees the task is essential. The data we save today will be unreadable tomorrow unless we actively migrate it to new formats, just as medieval monks meticulously copied crumbling Latin texts onto fresh parchment. That constant, laborious work of translation and transcription is what saved the works of Aristotle and Plato for the modern world. It was not a single heroic act, but a chain of effort stretching across continents and centuries, from Baghdad to Toledo to Oxford. This distributed network of scribes, often working in isolated monasteries, created a resilient, redundant system. No single disaster could destroy all the copies. Our modern equivalent is not a single, impenetrable digital fortress, but a global, decentralized network of archives, each holding mirrored copies of our most vital knowledge. This means international cooperation, not corporate or national silos. It means investing in open, non-proprietary file formats that anyone can access, rather than formats locked behind a specific company's software. The imperative is to build a living, breathing system for our cultural memory, one that adapts and copies itself across generations of technology. The Ghost of Alexandria's Final Whisper is not a story of loss, but a clear instruction. It tells us that preservation is a verb, not a noun. It is something we must do every day or watch our own world slowly fade to black, one unreadable file at a time. The control of information has always been a lever of power. In the great libraries of antiquity, access was a privilege reserved for elite scholars, priests, and those in the royal court. The vast collections were not public resources, but carefully guarded treasures. This ancient gatekeeping finds a direct parallel in our modern landscape of paywalled academic journals and restrictive intellectual property laws, where life-saving medical research or pivotal historical analysis can be locked behind a subscription fee. The fundamental ethical question remains unchanged: who gets to learn? The motivation for destroying knowledge was equally rooted in control. When a conqueror burned a library, it was not always an accident of war. It was often a deliberate act of narrative erasure, an attempt to silence a conquered people's history, their gods, and their scientific achievements, replacing them with the story of the victor. This is the ancient precursor to modern information warfare, where digital archives are targeted to reshape historical memory and suppress dissent. The ethical weight placed on the librarians of Alexandria or the scholars of the House of Wisdom was immense. They were the custodians of human understanding, tasked with deciding which texts to acquire, translate, and preserve. Their modern equivalents are the executives and engineers at our major tech platforms, who make daily decisions about what content is amplified, what is demoted, and what is removed entirely. Their algorithms and content moderation policies are, in effect, a new form of curation, shaping global perception on a scale those ancient librarians could never have conceived. This power to include or exclude information carries profound consequences. The choice to discard a scroll on herbal medicine or a dissenting philosophical text in the ancient world could mean the loss of a cure or the silencing of a world-changing idea for millennia. Today, the choice to delist a site from search results or to remove a video from a platform can erase a perspective from public discourse just as effectively. The ghost of this selective preservation haunts our current debates over net neutrality and digital free speech. It forces us to ask who holds the ethical compass for our global digital library, and how do we ensure that the pursuit of profit or political control does not become the final, fiery chapter in our own story of knowledge. That final principle, knowledge as capital, is the ghost in our global economic machine. The price tag for all those burned libraries is not just a historical curiosity, it is a permanent drag on our collective prosperity. We can begin to grasp the scale by considering a single pivot point in history, the Industrial Revolution. What if the basic principles of the steam engine, already understood by Hero of Alexandria, had been common knowledge for centuries? The mechanization of textile manufacturing, the rise of railroads, the entire transformation from an agrarian to an industrial world might not have begun in the 1700s. It could have started in the 1300s or even earlier. This is not just a shift in dates. An industrial revolution occurring 500 years earlier would have fundamentally reshaped global trade routes, population growth, and technological development, creating a world whose economic and political landscape we can barely imagine. The compounding interest on that lost time is an economic impact beyond any calculation. This historical delay ripples into our present in very tangible ways. Modern civil engineers are still trying to reverse engineer the secret of Roman concrete, a material that hardens underwater and remains intact after 2,000 years. Our own modern port infrastructures, seawalls, and bridges require constant, costly maintenance and repair. If we possessed that original formula, the global savings on construction and infrastructure resilience would amount to hundreds of billions of dollars every single year. That is the direct economic ghost of a single lost recipe. The cost in human health is even more staggering. Ancient medical texts from Alexandria and other centers contain detailed anatomical knowledge and herbal remedies that were lost for over a millennium. During that gap, societies endured waves of plague and pandemic with only rudimentary medical care. The economic devastation of these unchecked diseases, in terms of lost labor, collapsed trade, and social instability, is incalculable. If that medical knowledge had flowed uninterrupted, allowing for the gradual development of germ theory and advanced pharmacology centuries sooner, the cumulative economic benefit from a healthier, more productive global population would dwarf the entire gross domestic product of many modern nations. This is not merely a lost opportunity, it is a vast negative economic space that has haunted our development. Every dollar and every hour spent by modern scientists and engineers to rediscover principles that were already documented in antiquity represents a massive sunk cost. It is a redundant investment forced upon us by the fires of the past. The pharmaceutical company researching a new compound only to find it in an ancient herbalist scroll. The materials scientist painstakingly analyzing a Roman aqueduct. The entire field of archaeology dedicated to digging up answers we already once possessed. All of this effort is a monumental duplication of work. This historical rework has siphoned off intellectual and financial capital that could have been directed toward genuinely new frontiers in energy, space exploration, or medicine. The unequal distribution of global wealth today is in part a legacy of this fractured knowledge transfer. Some regions benefited from the scattered fragments that survived and were later built upon, while others saw their entire intellectual traditions erased, setting back their development for centuries. The ghost of Alexandria is therefore not a neutral historical presence. It is an active force that has made our world poorer, sicker, and more vulnerable than it needed to be. It makes the modern task of preserving our digital knowledge not just an academic duty, but the wisest economic investment we could possibly make. This deep-seated dread of amnesia is etched into our cultural DNA. We are a species terrified of vanishing without a trace, a fear born from the repeated trauma of watching our greatest achievements turn to ash. That ancient specter of a burning library now manifests in the frantic clicking of a save button, in our compulsive hoarding of terabytes of family photos, and in the silent, whirring server farms endlessly mirroring our digital lives. We are building monuments against oblivion, not from stone but from silicon. The haunting myth of Atlantis, a sophisticated civilization swallowed whole by the sea, is not just a story. It is a recurring nightmare of knowledge annihilation, a parable for every library that ever fell. Our modern apocalyptic fiction follows the same terrifying script. The horror in these stories is not just the collapse of society, but the specific erasure of its memory, the burning of books, the corruption of data cores, the silencing of all recorded history. This is the ultimate psychological defeat, the fear that we will not only die, but that we will be forgotten. This collective anxiety may well be an evolutionary adaptation, a cultural immune response to the historical trauma of losing Alexandria, Baghdad, and Nalanda. Our ancestors who survived those intellectual dark ages passed down a visceral imperative: preserve or perish. That instinct now drives our technological behavior in profound and sometimes contradictory ways. It fuels the noble work of digital archivists striving to save every website, but it also feeds a modern paranoia about data security and privacy. We are simultaneously terrified of losing our information and of it falling into the wrong hands. This is the ghost of the library guardian reincarnated, the eternal custodian wrestling with the dual threats of destruction and theft. Our drive to encrypt, to backup, to store in triplicate is not merely logical. It is emotional, a deep psychological bulwark against the haunting silence of a future that has forgotten our name. This unconscious fear is the powerful undercurrent shaping our relationship with technology, making us both the architects of our own digital Alexandria and the terrified scribes praying it does not share the same fate. That same ghost haunts our relationship with the living world. Within those lost scrolls were entire encyclopedias dedicated to the subtle language of nature, detailed manuals for survival that understood the earth not as a warehouse to be plundered, but as a partner to be understood. Ancient civilizations from the Roman Empire to the Khmer developed sophisticated systems of water management, using gravity and precise engineering to create sustainable aqueducts and reservoirs that supported vast populations for centuries. The specific treatises explaining the maintenance of these systems, the knowledge of seasonal siltation and watershed management, turned to dust. When that wisdom vanished, later societies were often left to confront floods and droughts with far less effective tools, leading to famine and the collapse of settlements that had once thrived. Botanical knowledge suffered a similar fate. The great libraries housed meticulous classifications of plants, documenting their medicinal properties, their growth cycles, and their roles within local ecosystems. These were not just lists of names, they were deep observational records that tracked how forests regenerated after a fire or how specific crops could replenish soil nutrients. Losing this data was like throwing away the key to a complex, self-repairing machine. We abandoned a philosophy of working within natural cycles and instead adopted a more aggressive, short-term approach, viewing land as something to be dominated and extracted from until it was exhausted. This intellectual shift paved the way for the extractive mindset that defines much of our industrial history. We replaced the library's lessons on symbiotic agriculture with a model that relies heavily on chemical inputs, a system that gives high yields in the short term but often degrades the very soil it depends on. The loss of indigenous knowledge, often recorded or summarized in these great centers of learning, was particularly devastating. Entire languages of the land, developed over thousands of years of direct observation, were silenced. We are only now, through painstaking archaeological and anthropological work, rediscovering the brilliance of systems like the Three Sisters, where Native American cultures planted corn, beans, and squash together in a mutually supportive relationship that naturally fertilized the soil and suppressed weeds. This was agroecology mastered millennia ago, a masterpiece of sustainable design that was lost to the wider world for centuries. The consequence of this great ecological amnesia is written in our contemporary landscape, in the eroded topsoil, the collapsing fisheries, and the dwindling biodiversity. Our current environmental challenges are not merely the result of new technology, they are also the product of a profound forgetting. We are trying to solve the problems of sustainability with only a fraction of the available toolkit, unaware that the most elegant solutions might have been documented long ago in a library that no longer exists. This calls for a new humility in our technological ambitions, a recognition that the most advanced artificial intelligence may still have lessons to learn from a scroll on water conservation written 2,000 years ago. Our modern classrooms are built on a foundation of historical accidents. The canon of great books studied in universities across the world does not represent the full spectrum of ancient genius. but merely the collection of texts that managed to slip through the filter of catastrophe. The philosophical and scientific works that survived did so largely by chance, preserved in remote monasteries or buried in desert sands, while arguably more revolutionary ideas turned to ash in the great libraries. This means the entire trajectory of Western thought and education was channeled into a particular, narrow riverbed. We teach the philosophies of Plato and Aristotle not necessarily because they were the absolute best, but because their writings were the ones that were copied and recopied, generation after generation. The absence of their rivals and critics, whose works were lost, has left us with a somewhat unbalanced and incomplete picture of ancient intellectual life. The same is true for literature. We marvel at the plays of Sophocles, but we only have 7 of his over 120 works. Our entire perception of Greek drama is based on a tiny, random sample of what once existed. This educational void means that for centuries, students have been taught a curated version of history, one missing entire schools of thought that could have provided alternative models for ethics, governance, and even reality itself. The loss of certain mathematical texts had a particularly profound effect on how we teach fundamental concepts. We know that Archimedes was grappling with ideas eerily similar to calculus, using methods of exhaustion to calculate areas and volumes. His text, The Method, was lost for centuries, only rediscovered in the famous palimpsest where his words were scrubbed away to make room for a prayer book. Before its recovery, historians believed such sophisticated mathematical thought was impossible in the ancient world. Its reappearance forced us to completely rewrite the history of mathematics. Imagine how different our science and engineering curricula might be if his work, and that of his peers, had flowed continuously into the modern era instead of being cut off for over a millennium. The way we teach logic, geometry, and even physics was shaped by this absence, forcing the development of alternative, and sometimes more cumbersome, approaches to problem solving. This fragmentation directly affects how we train our scientists, engineers, and leaders today. An engineer educated only on the surviving works of the Romans might approach a bridge differently than one who also had access to the lost hydraulic texts of the Mesopotamians. A political leader shaped solely by a canon that excludes certain philosophical traditions may lack the intellectual tools to understand different models of justice or social organization. Our modern debates over educational content and standards are, in a very real sense, arguments held in the shadow of these ancient libraries. The fight over which books belong on the syllabus is a struggle to fill a void we can barely perceive, a gap left by scrolls we can no longer read. The ghost of lost educational materials is a constant reminder that our curriculum is not a perfect reflection of human achievement. It is a patchwork, a collection of survivors, and we must teach with the humility that the most important lesson might be the one that was forever lost to the flames. Yet against this overwhelming tide of loss, a few precious threads of knowledge miraculously survived. Their stories are not merely lucky accidents, but a masterclass in resilience. In the dry, sterile air of the Egyptian desert, countless papyrus scrolls endured for millennia, protected from the decay that moisture brings. The very same text stored in the humid climate of a Mediterranean coastal city would have turned to pulp within centuries. Geography itself became a librarian, curating a collection by the ruthless logic of climate. This is why we have such a rich record from Egypt, while the literary output of other, rainier ancient civilizations has vanished almost completely. The medium also proved critical. The Epic of Gilgamesh, one of humanity's oldest stories, did not survive on fragile papyrus. It endured because it was pressed into wet clay tablets, which were then baked hard in a kiln. When the royal library of Ashurbanipal at Nineveh was set ablaze, the fire did not destroy these tablets. It ironically fired them again, preserving them for modern archaeologists to discover. The most fragile texts died, while the stories written in mud and fire lived on. This teaches a powerful lesson. The durability of knowledge is directly tied to the diversity of its containers. But the most vital preservation system was not a place or an object, but a human tradition. Through the long European Middle Ages, while war and instability raged, Benedictine monks in isolated monasteries dedicated their lives to copying. In cold, quiet scriptoria, they meticulously transcribed the works of Cicero, Plato, and Aristotle onto fresh parchment. They were not just duplicating words, they were acting as a living, distributed backup drive for civilization. No single monastery held all of classical knowledge, but each one safeguarded a few crucial volumes. When one center of learning was sacked, its unique copies might be lost, but the texts themselves survived elsewhere, in another monastery over the mountains. This decentralized network, though slow and laborious, was incredibly robust. Simultaneously, in the flourishing intellectual centers of the Islamic world, a parallel project was underway. Scholars in Baghdad's House of Wisdom and elsewhere did not just preserve Greek knowledge, they actively translated and expanded upon it, adding groundbreaking commentaries and original discoveries in mathematics, astronomy, and medicine. This preserved corpus was then reintroduced to a reawakening Europe through cultural crossroads like Muslim Spain, rekindling the very intellectual fires that had been extinguished centuries before. The survival of these works was a chain of human effort stretching across continents and cultures. It relied on redundancy, with many copies spread across wide geographical areas. It relied on media diversity, from baked clay to animal skin parchment, and it relied on a continuous, cross-cultural commitment to the act of preservation itself. These stories are a profound counterpoint to the narrative of loss. They demonstrate that knowledge can be saved from the abyss, but only if we are deliberate, distributed, and diverse in how we protect it. The Ghost of Alexandria, therefore, is not just a warning, it is a guidebook, its empty shelves pointing directly toward the strategies that actually work. These ghosts of vanished libraries offer us a blueprint for survival. The lesson is not to abandon our grand digital collections, but to fortify them with the wisdom of the past. We must build systems that are not just vast, but resilient by design, creating a global memory that can withstand the shocks that felled its ancient predecessors. This begins with decentralization. Instead of a single digital Alexandria, we need a distributed network of archives, where countless copies of our most vital knowledge are mirrored across independent servers in different countries and on different continents. A cyber attack or natural disaster that takes down one node would leave the rest of the network intact, just as the scattered monastic scriptoria of the Middle Ages saved classical texts from any single local catastrophe. This digital redundancy is our first and strongest line of defense against a new dark age. Alongside this geographic spread, we must embrace media diversity. Our digital files are ephemeral, threatened by format obsolescence and hardware decay. The solution is to pair them with stable, long-lasting physical counterparts. Projects are now underway to encode vast amounts of data onto tiny nickel discs etched with lasers, a modern version of the fired clay tablets that preserved the Epic of Gilgamesh. Other initiatives print precious books and documents on archival quality, acid-free paper designed to last for centuries without degrading. This hybrid approach, combining the searchability of digital files with the stubborn permanence of physical artifacts, creates a powerful insurance policy. It ensures that even if our future generations lose the key to our software, they will still have a durable, analog record of our achievements. The very languages our data speaks must also be liberated. Relying on proprietary file formats controlled by a single corporation is like entrusting all our scrolls to a scribe who uses a secret cipher. When that company goes out of business or that software becomes obsolete, the knowledge is trapped. The imperative is to develop and use open, standardized formats for documents, images, and videos that are publicly documented and can be read by any system, now and in the future. This prevents our digital legacy from being held hostage by the shifting fortunes of the technology market. Future-proofing knowledge means building it to be independent, ensuring that the instructions for reading a file are as enduring as the data itself. Perhaps the most profound shift is to embed preservation into the heart of technology design, not treat it as an expensive afterthought. Just as the builders of the Great Pyramids engineered them to last for millennia, the architects of our digital world must design for permanence from the very first line of code. This means creating systems that automatically create checksums to detect data corruption, that facilitate easy migration to new formats, and that include preservation metadata as a fundamental component. It is about building a culture of stewardship into our software and hardware, making the act of saving as intuitive as the act of creating. This monumental task cannot be the burden of a single nation or corporation. It requires a new cosmopolitanism, a global alliance for memory. Initiatives like the Internet Archive, which tirelessly crawls the web-saving snapshots of our digital culture, or UNESCO Memory of the World program, which identifies and protects documentary heritage of universal value, are the modern embodiments of the ancient library's ideal. They represent a shared commitment to guarding our collective intellectual inheritance, recognizing that knowledge belongs to humanity as a whole. The ultimate lesson from the ashes of Alexandria and Baghdad is that the only system resilient enough to survive civilizational disruption is one that is distributed, diverse, and built on international cooperation. We honor those lost libraries not by mourning them, but by finally learning from their fate and constructing a memory for our species that is truly and forever